Hi, and welcome to the Astrology of Family Karma and Relationships podcast. I am your host, Alexander Mallon, and today we're going to have another discussion that pertains to sort of the collective family consciousness that we are having this autumn of 2025. Those of us who are living through it certainly recognize there's a lot happening. There's a lot that's percolating in the collective psyche these days. And we're going to kind of jump into a couple of topics that not everybody necessarily watches, astrologically speaking. But as some of you might know, the fact that I'm also a very avid amateur backyard astronomer as well as a pro astrologer, I do literally look into what's happening in a physical, visual way every clear evening that I have a chance. So perhaps um, what I'd like to do is a screen share here of some things I've worked on to uh, demonstrate what these cycles are that we want to pay attention to. I'm kind of loosely calling this time period of autumn 25 the whirlpool, because as I said, it feels like we're all in this incredible churning, maybe even boiling, roiling kind of a situation. And I would say that astrologically speaking, there are a couple of notable cycles that are happening. One that we are having a series of supermoons, each full moon from uh, September through January, September of 2025 into January of 2026. Each of these full moons are supermoons. We're also having these supermoons occur during this 20-year phase of the Major Lunar Standstill season that's been happening for over a year now. And then another major configuration that most of you do know who study astrology, this Saturn Neptune conjunction that we're having at the very tail end of Pisces these months. So, one thing we want to think about is that we've been going through this powerful time, uh, also just following a couple of important eclipses. The eclipses back in March of 2025, that there was a total lunar eclipse in March of 2025 at 24 degrees of Virgo, again, near that tail end of Virgo Pisces axis. There was also a partial solar eclipse at the end of March in early Aries. So it brings out that Virgo, Pisces, Aries, Libra axes of the chart. That's a really, really important thing to consider because in astro speak, we look at a number of areas of the sky as being particularly important. And one area is this world axis, this area called the world axis or the Aries point, that's 0 degrees Aries. So anything happening in and around that world point, that world axis, 0 Aries point, is particularly notable. And I have to say, at first, I maybe was a little cautious of this idea of this world axis, this Aries point, that in the last decade or 20 years has become a very important talking point astrologically for Western astrologers. But of course, that Aries point is a central theme for Western astrology because Western astrology is tropical or seasonal astrology. And those points, that Aries point and that opposite Aries point, the Libra point, the two points of the spring and autumnal equinoxes, are, are two of the eight major points, eight major turning points of each year. So when we have astrological major planetary alignments around that Aries point or around that major axes of the world chart, spring equinox, autumnal equinox, summer solstice, winter solstice, any of those four major points of the turning of the year, there's always something really big happening on the global stage. And of course, God knows we've been having that these past years quite extremely, certainly in the US, politically and even geopolitically, we could say, with a lot of floods and flooding that is, of course, worldwide as well, and certainly geopolitical upheaval. So, indeed, we can say this world axis point is a gateway to a new reality. Some astrologers talk about that. This 29 degrees Pisces, 0 Aries shift. Pisces being the end of the zodiac, dissolving illusions and ego and this sort of ego attachment that we have to what we think is real. And conversely, the beginning of the year, that Aries point every March, symbolically talks about the sense of the self rising, the self rising, autumn signs of the zodiac, autumn seasons of the zodiac, and winter seasons are really more about going within and focusing on the collective need and to our place in the collective. But spring and summertime zodiacal signs in general and seasons, really, that's what we're talking about with astrology, have so much more to do with our sense of selfhood in the world. What I'm going to do, you could say, since I did live for a while in a winter mountain environment, what I'm going to do when I get out of this cabin after being in the cabin all winter. It's a really powerful collective theme about post winter, moving into early springtime, sort of surging forward. So, whenever there is a planet or planets, as there are now, Saturn and Neptune, at that place of the zodiac that marks that demarcation, the tail end of winter and then the beginning of spring, summer, there's always this powerful collective sort of urge to create, urge to manifest. That's an important theme. So, indeed, Neptune's shift into Aries this past March of 2025 has coincided with this Saturn cycle as well, which is also hovering back on that Aries Pisces border, and we're in the tail end of that hovering, that sort of whirlpool. We're in that phase where, we have this major cycle that's sort of pregnant to birth itself into the beginning of Aries, and it's sort of retrograding back and forth, both Saturn and Neptune, literally retrograding back and forth from Aries back into Pisces and back into Aries again soon. So this is kind of this pregnant pause, and yet it's full of sort of a psyche energy, you could say. So I think that these recent full moons that we've had this autumn of 2025, in fact, these full moons that are all supermoons, we'll talk about that in a moment, are particularly potent times. It's sort of saying, since we had that last lunar and solar eclipse in September that fell into those degrees of late Pisces, at 29 degrees Pisces area that Saturn and Neptune occupy these months of 25 into 26. It's a particularly heightened time. Like these full moons are bringing that potency. The moon deals with the sense of emotional body, emotional self. The moon and moon cycle, of course, a 29.5 degree cycle. Every woman knows all about that. That 29.5 degree cycle every month from new moon to full moon and back again, does talk about the psyche, the movement of the collective psyche in a daily fashion. All astrology students and all astrologers know the moon's changing signs every 2.5 days is a potent indicator of that collective psychic shift from day to day, month to month. This particular full moon of this month, November 2025, this full moon fell right in the middle of the sign of Scorpio. Right, in fact, at one of those other important turning points of the year, not just the big four, the equinoctial points and the solstitial points, the equinoxes and solstices, but the other four, those cross-quarter days. This one happening just after Halloween on November 5th, roughly. These supermoon that we're having of November falls at 15 degrees of Taurus Scorpio, very close to Samhain or Halloween, All Souls, All Saints Day. Really, those days of the year that we celebrate the end of the growing cycle, the end even of the harvest cycle, and the beginning of the waiting for the next birthing in Aries in springtime. So we can think about what's called the Celtic cross. It talks about these cross-quarter days of seasons, not only those equinoctial points, the Aries point, the Libra point, the Cancer point, and the Capricorn point, those four turning points of the major seasons, springtime, summertime, fall, and winter, But the in-between seasons are also extraordinarily important in the Celtic cultures of Europe, ancient Europe. I think of Stonehenge. Those cross-quarter days were equally super important. You could think of sort of midsummer or midwinter. So here we are in the middle of fall. We're at that really truly turning point from the tail of the warmth of the summertime past and the beginning of the winter and the cold descending. And that is what's happening, of course, here in early November. I love to also uh, note that there is an interesting coincidence. These 8 seasonal points, uh, spring equinox, mid-spring, or Beltane, the summertime solstice point, midsummer, Lammas, um, the fall autumnal equinox, which we're having now, which always occurs, of course, in 0 degrees Libra, and then that mid-autumn point that we're having right this moment, that time of Samhain Halloween. Um, these are a number of those 8 seasonal turning points that do interestingly coincide with the Dharma wheel, the 8-spoked Dharma wheel of Tibetan Buddhism, Buddha's eightfold path to enlightenment. Uh, really, all cultures are integrated with the environment around them. That is the essence of astrology. Astrology is simply noting and observing human development, human cultural shift through these seasonal periods. That is what astrology is all about. So here we are somewhere on this Buddhic wheel, on Buddha's wheel of consciousness, while we're going through these powerful cycles of this Samhain, or this autumnal mid-season point uh, of Halloween and All Souls Day. So these supermoons, what are they astronomically? Well, astronomically, there is such a thing as a supermoon. It's a term coined by fellow astrologer Michael Irwine, um, but astronomers have adopted it because it's a very excellent sort of moniker for it. That we have literally micromoons, moons that are much smaller in the sky, and supermoons that are much brighter and larger appearing in the nighttime sky. A supermoon is about 15% larger than an average sized moon. In other words, the moon is in perigee, or close approach to the Earth, a few times a year, each year. So while the media would have us think supermoons are something extraordinarily amazing to watch, they happen usually 2 or 3 or 4 times a year. So we have in this graph a local TV station says, weather impact, back-to-back supermoons. Well, yeah, when you have full moon time, new moon and full moon, of course, that's when you typically have, major tidal effects. We all know that. And these supermoons, where the moon is much closer to the Earth, and therefore, in its perigee cycle, close to the Earth, very much larger, we have even greater tidal effects that happen. So we've had these series of supermoons at the tail end, the fall of 2025 into the next year, 26. We had that lunar eclipse in September. We have the harvest moon and now the beaver moon of November, harvest moon of October, and the beaver moon, I should say actually harvest moon of September, and the hunter's moon, I believe. This graph should show that, the hunter's moon. So we're having a series of supermoons, full moons. Each full moon is a supermoon, the tail end of this year. So we have the harvest moon, the hunter's moon, the beaver moon, the cold moon, and upcoming in February, the wolf supermoon. These are all supermoons. We could say the emotional vibe, the emotional psyche is particularly potent during these months, and all happening, of course, during this major lunar standstill time period. So every roughly 20 years, folks, we have a thing called a major lunar standstill, when the moon is particularly high in the sky. Literally, with a major lunar standstill, it's rising in the northeast, and its culminating is literally almost at the zenith over one's head. And that quality of the moon being super, super high in the sky is something that the ancients made note of. In fact, that is what those dolmen or standing stones all over the planet, particularly, of course, most famously Stonehenge, that's what those standing stones are all about. Not just to mark those equinoctial and social solstitial points, those times of springtime, fall, midsummer, and winter, not just those four turning points of the year, but especially those standing stones mark these mid-season times, and most particularly these major lunar standstills. Where those dolmen, those standing stones were placed was to mark when and where we would have those major lunar events, where we'd have these major lunar events, times that coincided with massive cultural restructuring. And that is what we're having right now, certainly, obviously, worldwide in 2025. This particular 20-year phase of this major lunar standstill, along with other major astrological cycles that are mirroring or coinciding, are suggesting this to be a particularly volcanic time, even quite likely literally. Certainly, we're seeing in Asia, we're seeing major weather events, major rainfall events, uh, major hurricane events all over the planet. These years, more and more and more weather systems being larger and larger, major storms, megastorms are occurring during this major lunar standstill time period. It's also interesting that these major lunar standstills, when the moon is super, super high in the nighttime sky, it can only happen when the north node of the moon is traveling through Pisces Aries, as it's doing in 2024, 25 into 26. So these Aries times, think of Aries being that springtime, that vernal equinox, the sign that coincides with bursting forward. That's the energy of this time, bursting forward. So in the sky, we're having this major conjunction of Saturn and Neptune also. They are very, very close to each other astronomically. In fact, take a telescope, as I do with my observatory, and they're only a couple of degrees away from each other visually. It is literally a pairing of that Saturnine principle, Saturnine, a proper word, Saturnine principle of structure and restructuring, that those rings symbolize, although the ancients could not possibly have seen the rings, although some theorize that some cultures, early cultures, might have caught a glimpse of something, naked eye. But now we know with telescopic views that Saturn has this magnificent ring system. It's a perfect coincidence that Saturn's cycles that have always coincided with human development, human developmental cycles, age 7, 14, 21, etc., every 30 years, Saturn returns to where it was when we were each born. So age 30, 60, 90. These are all major developmental age periods, age 7, 14, 21, 30, those sort of quadrant divisions of that 30-year cycle. So Saturn coincides, its cycles, for humans with these developmental milestones, these aging milestones that we all have. That's what Saturn's about. Neptune was discovered 1846, and what happened in the mid 1800s, certainly themes around chemicals and the periodic table and understanding nature and how to harness the power of nature, certainly through chemistry, as well as through the developing of other power systems like nuclear power. All of those things are Neptunian, sort of outside the bounds of the constraint of material plane, uh, fire and stone. We're beyond that in these modern eras. So Neptune, discovered because we had the industrial revolution. We invented a telescope and lenses to see Neptune. So when we were aware of Neptune, the coincidence for humankind is this breaking through to new consciousness, new areas of understanding. I like to think of Neptune's discovery in the 1800s and early 1900s coinciding. I think of Madame Curie, and her experiments, groundbreaking experiments with radiation. You can't hold it, you can't see it, you can't smell it, but yet it's there. That's the realm of Neptune, things that are there, but we can't readily grasp them, versus Saturn, things that are, material and real and, tangible, things we can hold in our hands. So here we have this collection of this I should say sort of collision of the material of Saturn and the Saturnian planet Neptune. It's in the realms of the ideal, the realms of ideology, the realms of what's hard to perceive, the collective, the feeling, the intuitive, the gut, the sense of social belonging and social meaning. That's all Neptunian stuff. So the Saturn Neptune conjunction talks about this powerful combining of these two energetics, the materialization, Saturn, and the idealization or social idealization of Neptune. Neptune is about social identification. A really key thing about the Saturn Neptune cycle, as I'll show you in a little bit, is that it falls right on the US chart, right where Neptune was 165 years ago. Neptune's orbit is 165 years. So Neptune's having a Neptune return for the US chart, right where it was during the beginning of our Civil War. A civil war about ideologies, about spiritual and Saturn material ideologies. We're back in that cycle very powerfully in 2025. This is all, of course, occurring, Saturn Neptune conjunction, in the sign of Pisces at 29 degrees Pisces, 0 Aries, the very tail end of Pisces. For astrologers, that tail end of any sign sort of describes the culmination. And Pisces, well, to understand collectively what that is, you could think of the rise of Christianity. Christianity is that Pisces era, not the age of Aquarius, but the age of Pisces, the 2,000 years of Pisces. Pisces spirituality and a sense of the emotional spiritual connection. We're shifting into the age of Aquarius, and any astrologer can tell you the age of Aquarius is equated to what? Spirituality? No. AI technology, artificial intelligence. That's the new direction that we're heading into. One last little thing about this Saturn Neptune conjunction that I've talked about in other shows. We're having also not just a 20-year lunar standstill cycle, but we're also having a 15-year ring plane crossing. This is a cycle that 99% of astrologers never think about or talk about, or probably don't even know about. But when you're an amateur astronomer, this is one of those incredible things that all astronomers look forward to with Saturn. One reason we look forward to it is because as Saturn's rings disappear to our line of sight, as the Earth Saturn relationship around the Sun kind of gets us to the point of being on the equator of Saturn, we see those rings edge on. And when we see those rings edge on, it enables us to see the moons that transit across the planet of Saturn. So we get to learn a lot more about if you will, the morphology of the planet from an astronomical standpoint. But from a visual astronomer astrologer, one of the interesting phenomena about Saturn's ring plane, the rings disappearing, is in the nighttime sky, Saturn becomes much more dim during this cycle. In other words, the constraint of the rings, that the fact that the rings describe, symbolize to people this idea of constraint or structure or functional structure, though that structure disappears. And those 15-year cycles, when Saturn's ring plane crossing occurs to the Earth, when we have those Saturn rings disappear, those 15-year cycles coincide with, in some way, the disappearance of structure or the disappearance of constraint. Positively, we had one of the last times President Barack Obama, the first person of color elected as president of the U.S. when we had ring plane crossing. During President Trump's first presidential inauguration, the rings were wide open. In other words, the principles of the GOP and the structure that wants to contain and impose itself, the rings of Saturn were wide open during Trump's first presidential run and achievement. And now, during Trump's second presidential term, we are at ring plane crossing. The constraints of society, the constraints of the office of president, the constraints of the law, the constraints of what is Saturnine structure and social structure are removed. undeniably, that is happening during this presidency in a way that this presidency of the US has never seen in our country's 250-year existence, where the presidency and the presidential structures and inhibitions are removed. So, this conjunction of Saturn structure and Neptune dissolve, Saturn structure and Neptune ideology, this conjunction actually is happening astrologically, astronomically, very close to this fixed star. And that fixed star is called Scheat. Scheat, it's actually Arabic. And Scheat basically means the elbow or the shoulder of Pegasus the horse. It's the part of the great square of Pegasus. You see the four stars, Alpheratz, Scheat, Markab, and Algenib. Those form the great square of Pegasus. Every amateur astronomer looks up and sees this big box in the sky. If you connect the dots, it looks like a big box in the sky. For astronomers, we have the Andromeda Galaxy over in this part of Pegasus, just off of one of its hind legs. For astronomers, we have a wonderful globular cluster here of stars, M15, off of the NF, the tip of the nose of Pegasus the horse. In mythology, Pegasus was to have said to be sprung from the Gorgon Medusa's head. When Perseus slayed the Gorgon Medusa, out sprang this magnificent winged horse. And so the mythology around Pegasus deals with ambition and freedom and sort of strides and galloping and flying and moving to where we want to move freely, having power. It's about power, themes of personal power. This particular fixed star that rises first, when it rises over the horizon, when this constellation rises, what we actually see rising first is this star Scheat. And that star Scheat, the ancients said, oftentimes seems to coincide with societal, social turbulences or shifts. They called it the star of shipwreck. There are a number of fixed stars whose cycles, astrologically with planets hitting them, seem to coincide with some kind of a sort of explosive situations. Used to be shipwreck, but there is continue to be these unusual sort of explosive scenes like we're having right now worldwide regarding democracy, explosive situations worldwide, not only environmentally with bigger and bigger hurricanes, etc., but we're having geopolitics. We're even having really sort of the Earth climate issue come to this extreme point. So Scheat deals with shipwreck and upsetments and extreme explosive situations. Astrologer who wrote one of the definitive books on fixed stars and astrology, Robeson, talks about this constellation and this star: ambition, vanity, intuition, enthusiasm, caprice, and bad judgment, as well as violent disaster and misfortune. Usually, this fixed star Scheat seems to coincide when planets hit that area. That's 29 degrees of Pisces, the tail end of Pisces, astrologically speaking. And it talks about explosive situations, explosive turbulences that are happening. And that's what we see under this Saturn Neptune conjunction. So the question might be for all of us, since this is a particularly powerful conjunction of Neptune Saturn, where does that tail end of Pisces Aries fit in my chart? Well, we can look at it collectively at the US chart. I like to use what's called the Ebenezer Sibley chart, which says the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence occurred at 5:10 p.m. on July 4th, 1776. And where does that Saturn-Neptune alignment fall on our U.S. chart? Here's the U.S. chart on the inner wheel. We are a Cancer nation with our sun at 13 degrees of Cancer. We're 13 days. Every July 4th is 13 days into the sign of Cancer, which occurs in June into July. So there's our sun. We have a big, wonderful bundle of planets here in that sign of Cancer. It says our nature as a collective culture of the U.S. is Cancer, July, the month of birthing. Here's the glyph or symbol. It symbolizes a crab. A crab is an animal, a totem that the ancients used to describe the middle of summertime and birthing because a crab gives birth to 500,000 young at once. 500,000 young, living young. are on the carcopus of the under shell of a crab. So that animal totem was given to this few stars of Cancer, not because the stars look like Cancer, but because that animal totem of July coincides with birthing, summertime, birthing. And so you could say our nation of the US is about birthing and the home and the people and the family, and families, the melting pot from all over. Saturn Neptune right now is at the bottom of our US chart. You see it here graphically with the arrow. There's Neptune, there's Saturn at the bottom of our chart, right at what astrologers call the nadir. And the nadir, the bottom of a person's chart, describes midnight point, where the sun is. It rises, it culminates at noon, it sets in the west, and at the bottom, when the sun is below our feet, the observer's feet, that's that nadir. Not noon hour, but the opposite. And so the nadir describes your bed, your home, your nest, your emotional and psychic point of center. So to have that Saturn Neptune at the bottom of one's chart says there's something really big about Saturn structure and Neptune ideologies, Saturn material physical world that we are living in, our job, our career, our house, our home, and Neptune, well, Neptune's watery, like floods. Indeed, we're having bigger and bigger floods, bigger and bigger storms worldwide, but certainly nationally as well. And of course, we're having sort of a proverbial storm at the root of our chart, the root of who we are as a nation and as a people. That also is a really big part of this 2025 cycle. So, recapping, three major things. We're having these full moons, this series of supermoons of autumn 2025 occur in those autumnal signs: Virgo, Pisces, Libra, Aries, Scorpio, Taurus, and soon the next full moon in December, Sagittarius, Gemini, those opposite signs I'm including here. So Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, these full moons of these months, this fall, autumn of 2025, are all super moons, super large. And because it is part of this 20-year cycle of a major lunar standstill, these moons are all way, way high in the nighttime sky, a cycle the ancients would not have missed. They looked at those cycles and realized when those moons are super, super moons, when those moons are super high in the sky, it occurs every 20 years with the time of massive social, political change. We're also having these super moons, this particular moon in November 2025, right at one of those major turning points, the turning point of Halloween, All Souls Day, this idea of reviewing the life we've been building and what we have harvested and what we're building in the next chapter, the next spring. And what are we planting? What seeds are we planting for the next harvest is a good way to understand this bigger theme. Those supermoons, that major lunar standstill high overhead, defining cultural change, only happening when the north node of the moon, that is eclipse cycles, occur in Aries and Pisces. We're now also having another major cycle, the Saturn Neptune, at the end of Pisces into Aries, a radical readjustment of what we think reality can and should be, a replication of the cycle of the mid 1800s, around 1860, when we had our last civil war here in the US. The same exact Neptune cycle now that we had then. A restructuring of our values and our ideals and our social ideals. And who are we as a country? That ring plane crossing, removing limitations. That fixed star Scheat, that fixed star that deals with shipwreck and or turbulence or change, where that Saturn Neptune are hanging out these entire months of 2025, a time of radical change, all happening at the bottom of the US chart, all happening at that center point of the US chart, along with this Pluto return we've talked about in other shows, along with this full moon cycle conjoining the planet Uranus, and Uranus in the sky returning to where it was when our nation was founded. Uranus return. Uranus deals with technology. This full moon, opposed to Saturn and Mercury right now in November of 2025, talks about explosive emotions, explosive feelings, explosive ideologies. So you're getting perhaps the sense of what this time period is about. It's all about um, radical shift, radical change, psychic readjustment. And again, I coined the phrase sort of like a whirlpool. We're in this whirlpool of Saturn, Neptune, back and forth across that world point, that Aries point. This whirlpool of the inner psyche kind of bubbling up for us to review who we are, where we're going, and what our personal ideologies are, and how those personal ideologies connect to the collective. So thank you all for watching. I appreciate your viewership. I appreciate if you will indeed subscribe to my podcast. The more subscriptions we have, the more we've got the algorithms enabling people to find us. And by all means, feel free to email your questions and thoughts. Till next time, Alexander Malin. See you again. Thank you.